Hello. I'm going to use the stand when I live code, but I will hold the microphone a little closer to my my mouth for this because I know in the back we've had some trouble hearing, so I'm going to do that. So, serverless architecture in Node. If you are not watching the live stream, that's probably because you're here, but I'm still promoting the live stream. Twitch TV/Techlahoma. So if you have friends that couldn't be here but want to see this talk, send them to that URL. Obligatory about me slide. I am also known as the Node botanist. Funny anecdote. One of the AV guys was playing Overwatch, and I was playing Overwatch, and we ended up in a match with each other, and he gets in a party chat and goes, "Are you the Node botanist I think you are?" And I'm like, "Probably." And he goes, "I saw your talk at Thunderplanes. It was amazing." We were on the different teams, so I was like, "Good luck. I don't know what to say here. Good luck. Thank you." So the Node botanist is another way I'm known. I live in ATX, Austin, Texas, not very far from here. I am a cat parent. I have 2 lovely cats that you'll see in an obligatory slide shortly. In addition to being a developer relations engineer at IOPipe full-time, I am also a full-time electrical engineering student at Arizona State University Online. So hopefully by the end of 2019, I will have a bachelor's degree in computer science and a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. Because I like robots, as you can see by the picture. This was just after David Bowie passed last year. I had built a rave outfit with UV lights, and you can kind of see on the sleeve there's lights. It was all internet controlled. So my friend helped me paint my face with UV sensitive paint, and so that's one of my favorite JavaScript outfits. Anyway. Obligatory cat slide, as I mentioned. These are my 2 lovely cats, Arya and Ace. They're very not happy that I'm not home right now, but they're cute. Anyways, serverless. I usually do that fluff at the beginning so people have time to sit down, and it looks like it worked because you're all mostly sitting. So what does serverless mean? It doesn't literally mean no servers. I mean, obviously, it'd be kind of weird if we just decided, hey, we're not going to have servers anymore. But it's easier to say serverless than to say someone else's fully managed execution environment that I only pay a fraction of a cent every time my function is run over and over and over again. So we went with the term serverless. So it's basically the next step up from infrastructure as a service, which if you've ever used AWS, OpenShift, or things like that, you've used infrastructure as a service where you don't care where the actual physical machine is. That's abstracted away. All you care about is what OS is running, what you can do with it, and what you can automate on that machine. Well, serverless is the next step up from that. It's also called function as a service by a lot of folks. And so same thing with IAAS, but the language runtime and HTTP serving in a lot of cases, depending on the provider, is also abstracted away. So all you need is the actual code for the function you want to execute. And sometimes you set when you want that code to execute. You can set it based on a cron job or an event or an HTTP URL that gets called. So an example, I actually kind of stole and modified this from the CTO of my company. She originally wrote one of her first serverless functions to scrape a website to check for sales on shoes. So I changed it to socks because everybody wears socks, hopefully not with sandals. And so let's say you have a function that scrapes a website for sales on socks because you want to know when socks are on sale. And you want to run it repeatedly, but you don't want to spin up an AWS micro instance and get it all set up and get Node installed and get this installed and that installed. Anybody ever try to install Node on AWS and think, oh, this will be a 5-minute thing because I've done it before, and then 4 hours later you're still installing Node on AWS? Am I the only one? I hear some giggles. I think it's the same thing as raising your hand. You don't care what OS this function's running on because it's a web scraper. And you don't care where it is. And you don't even really care what Node.js runtime it is as long as it's above a certain version. Like you don't care if it's Microsoft's Karma engine running behind it or V8. You don't care. It's Node. You're good. And so this is the perfect opportunity to set up a serverless function. You'd run this one on a schedule like every 24 hours or 12 hours over 5 minutes if you are really want to catch that sale. You run it on a schedule and bam, you're done. You don't have to worry about setting up an entire infrastructure just for one function. who provides serverless architecture? So I'm pretty sure a lot of people in this room have heard of AWS LAMBDA, which is one of the bigger ones. But there are a lot of serverless providers out there. And what's really great about that is not just the variety of providers, but the variety of languages, which we'll go into in a little bit. Microsoft Azure Functions just premiered some really cool debugging tooling at Serverless Conf Austin a few weeks ago. And they've been doing some really interesting stuff. Webtask.io, which is a product of Auth0, they do serverless functions as well. And then Apache OpenWhisk also has serverless function capabilities. That's just a few. That is by no means a comprehensive list, and I'm sure there are more serverless providers out there. Yeah, okay, cool. But why is Node.js so ubiquitous on serverless? This is a question I get a lot from non-Node devs, which is actually an extremely relevant question. I'm on a podcast called the Community Serverless Podcast, and in episode 2, we had a long discussion about why Node.js might not be the best runtime for serverless. And it got me thinking about why is Node.js ubiquitous right now? Why does every serverless platform immediately go to Node, and then maybe they'll support other languages down the road? The reason I believe Node.js is ubiquitous in serverless, I could be wrong. This is just what I've come across in my research and my asking people over and over again. It's on the web, and Node is on the web, and Node is the popular language of the web right now. I mean, and I state in a later bullet point, I'm not going to argue whether Node should be the popular language on the web, because I don't have time for that. I'm just stating a fact. Many serverless functions rely on asynchronous tasks, and many of them are web-related, and Node is good at that. That's probably one of the reasons. I think the main reason, though, is a lot of coincidence and happenstance, and, well, we already did it this way. Especially when AWS LAMBDA started to rely so heavily on Node, other serverless providers were basically not trying to catch up, but trying to match, have parity with AWS, and so Node became that ubiquitous language for everybody, not just for AWS LAMBDA. I think there's a lot of reasons that kind of coalesced. But Node isn't the only answer, and I know that's blasphemous coming out of the Node botanist, but I like other languages. They're pretty great. Python and .NET are both popular languages in the serverless world. AWS has first-class support for Python. Microsoft Azure Functions has .NET, of course. And AWS technically allows any executable. So you could run any language that spits out an executable as an AWS Lambda function. But there are some caveats, and it has to run on their container, and it can get a little messy. But I've seen people run Go and Java on AWS Lambda. So you can run multiple languages, but we're here to talk about Node. But the one thing I do want to say is you might not need Node, and that seems weird for a talk that's all about Node serverless architectures. But I do want to point out that maybe Node isn't the solution for you. And the reasons that the three reasons I can think of right off the bat is your team doesn't know it yet. That is an extremely valid reason. If you have a room full of Ruby programmers, you don't want to slam a Node book in front of them and go, "Hey, we're moving our whole architecture to Node by next sprint. Good luck," right? Not a fun time. If your tasks are not async heavy, there are a lot of Lambdas out there that do computations, that do data processing that are not necessarily asynchronous. Node may actually get in the way of doing these non-asynchronous processes. And you just don't plain don't want to write Node.js. Contrary to popular internet belief, you can still be a web dev and not like Node. I mean, you can. Anyway, how does the serverless architecture work? So instead of building a REST API, like most of us would think about, or a SOAP API, if that's what you like to do, you build a set of interoperating functions that operate on resources, and eventually this becomes your application's backend. Most of the real-world scenarios that I've seen around serverless is you slowly replace each REST function or REST API call with a serverless function, and you just take over slowly until you have a bunch of interoperating serverless functions instead of one giant API. Right? Wait a minute. Isn't this basically microservices? I do not know why the serverless community hates the word microservices, but they really don't like that word. It's not technically microservices. However, I have found in my experience that thinking in terms of microservices can really help you build a serverless architecture because they have a lot in common. You need small encapsulated pieces of code that work together in a way that is loosely coupled, much like you would with microservices. And microservice architectures translate really well to serverless, but they are not one and the same. That I do want to make clear. So let's take a look at building an AWS Lambda function with the serverless framework to show kind of how easy it is to get started with a serverless function. So I'm going to put this here and not drop it or turn it off. Yep, you can still hear me. Good, good, good. All right, adjusted this. All righty. Go over to my... Okay, so actually, I'll show you the website for the serverless framework first. Oops, spoiler. So this is the website for the serverless framework. It's at serverless.com. It's run by Amazon and AWS, but it supports many platforms and providers for serverless. And I find it's a really good starting point for getting started with serverless, especially if this intimidates you, which it doesn't intimidate me so much as the UI can be infuriating. That's the word I'm thinking of. Just like a lot of AWS UIs, it can be infuriating. It can be really good, but I'm going to trip on this. There we go. All right. So instead of using the dashboard, we're going to use the command line. So what I'm going to do, make sure I'm in the right folder. All right. So I'm going to say serverless create. So I'm going to create a new serverless function. I'm going to use a template, and I'm going to cheat here and aha. All right. Dash template AWS / Node.js. There's also AWS / Python. There's ones for other providers. That's what I really like about the serverless framework is the templates. It just spits everything out in your folder, and you're ready to just write your function. Path, instead of test demo, I'm just going to put demo. And then it's created it. So I'm going to check it out. I've got a demo folder. So is this large enough? Do I need to make the text bigger? Okay. Little bit? Little bit. Oh, okay sign. Got it. Cool. Demo. ls. All right. So we've got a handler.js and a serverless.yaml. It used to put a package.json in there, but for some reason, this version of serverless framework did not. So I'm just going to npm init/y so that I have a package.json. So now I have everything I need to write a Node application. I've got a JS file, I've got a package.json, and I've got the serverless.yaml. So let's take a look at these files to kind of see what we're looking at here. Did you load over here? Is that why? What's going? There we go. All right. Demo, and then close test demo. All right. So we've got our handler.js. This is where we're going to write our code. This is going to look very familiar to those of you who have used Node before. Module.exports.name of function. So the name of our function is hello. It takes in an event and a context and a callback. Again, looks very familiar to those of you who have done Node. We've got a response, which has a status code of 200 and a body that has a message and an input of event. And so we can kind of see the event that came in. And then it calls the callback, and it's error first. So null means, hey, there was no problem. Yay. And then response. So they actually add some really handy code that if you don't want to use the HTTP event, you can just uncomment that code. Anyway, save it. So hopefully what will happen when I deploy and run this function is we'll get back a message saying go serverless version 1.0. Your function is executed successfully. Now that, serverless.yaml, I want to show you this. So this is provider specific. This is AWS. This YAML file tells AWS it gives a lot of configuration information to AWS. So our service is demo, our name, our provider, AWS, and then what runtime we want. They have Node 8, I believe, as of last week, or Node 7, one of the two. So you can change whichever Node runtime you want. And then there's a lot of commented out stuff here that's kind of outside the scope of this talk, but you can actually really take AWS to some borders and really do some cutting edge stuff here. So this is where we can customize how we want to lay out our code, because we don't necessarily want to put our JS in handler.js, right? So on this left side, I could rename this to foo, and that would look for foo.js. And then handler.hello would be foo.hello, and it would look for module.exports.hello from foo. I'm going to leave that alone for now, because every time I've messed with this in a live coding setting, it has backfired. Live coding, it's great, isn't it? So now that I have AWS configuration, I have my package.json, even though I don't have any dependencies, and I have my handler.js, I'm going to deploy serverless. I'm pretty sure I can do this one without cheating. Aha, I can. Serverless deploy. So now this is sending this to AWS. The only thing I did before the talk was put my AWS credentials into the serverless framework. I didn't want to do that on stage because I didn't want to have to reset all my keys after this talk. You know, you don't want to do that, especially since it's being recorded. So if I forget, that would be even worse. So what it's doing right now is it's creating a bunch of stuff. So it's creating a CloudFormation stack, and that is going to allow me to access the function easily. It's creating some S3 buckets. That's actually, it tarballs the code for you and saves it in an S3 bucket. So that's where your code lives, in a little S3 bucket. And then it takes a bit. It's creating a log group, which is great. And it creates the IAM roles for you. So you don't have to deal with the IAM console, because unless you're a DevOps person who knows the IAM console really, really well and knows every permission by heart, that can be a giant pain. I am not a DevOps person, so the fact that all of this is done for me, pretty awesome. I mean, I'm no more of a DevOps person than any other dev that's had to do FTP and all that other fun stuff. All right, so eventually, are there any questions while this is running? This is the perfect time to answer. Of course it stops there. Murphy's Law, right? So now I'm going to run my function, serverless, invoke, and then -f, and then hello, because our function name is hello. Ah, ta-da! I have code running on the web, just from writing a few lines of command line code. So as you can see, as you can't see because my face is in front of it. As you can see, it has responded with status code 200 and the body message from the node code. So now my node code is running. What you can do with this from here, you can install any node module you want that runs on, if it's a native module, it has to run on AWS's cloud container. However, I have not run into a native module that does not run on AWS's cloud container. So you can go with pretty much any node module you like. I'm going to move this out of the way before I trip on it. And yeah, you can write a node function that searches for socks and emails you via SendGrid, if you like SendGrid. AWS provides a lot of interoperation between Lambda functions. So not just running it from an HTTP call, you can also, here, I'll set up blank function here. And it kind of gives you this GUI, but you can also do this via the serverless.yaml file. You can set it up to run on a specific point. So based on S3, for instance, one of the common demos that people write in books is when you upload an image to S3, it puts a filter on it. So with AWS, at least, you can integrate it into a lot of Amazon's existing services and a lot of Amazon's existing events without having to do too much configuration. So now that we've done that. So there are some awesome parts to serverless architecture. Scalability is one of them. Much like infrastructure as a service, not having to worry about having enough machine power to run all your functions is kind of something that helps you sleep at night, unless AWS goes down. But if AWS goes down, the chances of your website being blamed are 0, because if Netflix is down, people have bigger problems. I find it definitely creates quick development, especially among Node.js users, because instead of having to spin up an AWS instance for every time they want to create an HTTP server or a function call, they just create the function call, serverless deploy, and off they go, instead of having to deal with all that infrastructure themselves. Vendor tooling is developing very, very quickly. Like I said, Azure Functions just put out a lot of debugging tools. AWS is really putting some force behind Lambda. But that IoT Heart Serverless is another reason that I in particular love IoT. So, or serverless, we all know why I love IoT. The reason for that is, if you've ever dealt with a microcontroller, we're talking about kilobytes to megabytes of RAM. And we're talking about CPUs that would have powered PCs about 10 to 12 years ago. We're talking about ARM Cortex M0s. So if you want to do something with calculations or with data from an IoT device, what kind of IoT devices collect data? I mean, I can't think of any off the top of my head. That's where serverless really comes into the IoT space, is being able to ship that data off as a JSON packet and let that serverless function churn through the data and do that for you. The picture behind that is it's a serverless skateboard. So I learned how to longboard recently, and I'm clumsy, as you can tell by the infinite number of solder burns on my hands and all that stuff. So I built a crash detection system for my longboard. It has a little accelerometer, and if it determines that I've stopped too quickly, it lights up a pendant that I wear. And if I don't hit the button in 5 seconds, it emails my roommate to tell him that I have probably crashed and to go look outside and make sure I am not dead. It also, as you can tell by the picture, lights up the skateboard, and my roommate was having a blast the other day changing the color of the lights as I was skating up and down the street. The reason the lights are there is because we like to longboard in the evening after work, and I ran over one too many rocks because I couldn't see them, so I put lights on it because that's what I do, is I put lights on things and then connect those things to the internet, and So yeah, so IoT and serverless are best buddies, and I could do a whole talk on why that's true, but I've given you kind of the gist there. There are some not so awesome parts to serverless architectures. Debugging can be really, really tricky. Yeah. CloudWatch is making progress with logs, but right now, pretty much, you remember the days of web dev before all the cool stuff Lucas talked about with the inspector, where you just had to console.log everything? Yeah, that's kind of where we're at with serverless right now. It's not great, but it is developing quickly, and monitoring AWS Lambda functions in particular, you can ask me because I know this firsthand, can be very tricky. DevOps folks are clamoring to make sure that their applications are still performant, and monitoring serverless functions is still tricky. And while there are lots of third-party solutions like IOPipe, which is who I work for, and many internal solutions like Azure's debugging tools are advancing, so you'll notice that this is basically the other side of the coin to vendor tooling is developing quickly, is the tooling is still developing. We actually kind of discussed this in the serverless podcast, and it came up, we ended up coming up with the phrase that has haunted our podcast ever since, which is both sides of the breakfast plate. And that comes from, we were talking about how tooling doesn't quite exist yet for serverless, but people don't want to go to serverless because of the tooling, but the tooling doesn't exist yet because there aren't a lot of people on serverless, but there aren't a lot of people in serverless because the tooling doesn't exist yet. You see where I'm going here? It's like this infinite chicken and the egg, and that's where we got both sides of the breakfast plate, because if you have chicken and egg, you have breakfast, if you're not vegan. Anyway, sorry about the digression into veganism. If you want to learn more, the repo for this talk has the slides and the code. It has 2 serverless functions in it now. It has the one I used to test my command line functions or my command line typing, and then the one I did just now. It's at github.com/nodebotanist/200OK-2017. I just realized that looks like 2000K or 200OK in the context of this conference. Should make sense. The serverless framework is at serverless.com. The Community Serverless podcast, we've just released our first and second episodes. Our third episode on IoT, which I am not a part of due to Google Calendar not understanding time zones. But there will be another IoT episode, is at serverlesspodcast.com. And I'm on that podcast fairly frequently. And then we do have a Slack channel, serverless-forum.slack.com, and it's full of experts from the field, people who work with serverless and who are more than willing to help answer your questions and help you learn more about serverless. I do have a brief aside since I am running way ahead of schedule. You should be up here too. Yes, you sitting there staring at me going, me? Yes, you. You have interesting experiences and things to say. You've had something cool happen to you at work. You've had a problem that you had to debug that someone could learn something from. You have done all of these things. And yes, your talk would be interesting, and no, you're not that boring, and yes, you could be a public speaker, especially if you're from an underrepresented group. I'll say that twice as loud, that you should be up here. Apply to Thunderplanes and other great conferences, though I can't say enough how great Thunderplanes is as a first-time conference. They treat speakers exceedingly well. They offer mentorship. They offer ways to get started, and they're looking for new voices. They actively reach out and say, you've never spoken before? Great, we want you on stage. So their CFP is open right now. I would apply and yeah, and get in touch with me. I'm happy to review talk proposals and slides. I've been professionally speaking for about 3 years now, so I can lend whatever I can to your talk proposals. And one bullet point I forgot is if you apply to one conference and they say no, do not give up. What people don't see is that for every time I'm up here on stage, I have applied to 20 conferences. I have a 1 in 20 acceptance rate on conferences. So if your first proposal is dejected, that's not because you wouldn't be a good speaker. That's just because that conference got so many talks that they couldn't fit you in. Keep trying. Don't just give up after the first rejection, because like there's only so many speaking slots, but eventually you will make your way through. Speakers are trying to get that information out there that yes, a lot of us get rejected a lot. So I'd like to give a special thanks to the organizers of this event. They've done a wonderful job, and this is a really great venue, and we have a really cool lineup of speakers, myself notwithstanding. Yeah, you know, let's give them a hand. Let's give the organizers a hand. And then I'd really like to thank Techlahoma. I remember when Techlahoma was founded. I was kind of watching from the sidelines, and I thought, wow, they're gonna do some cool stuff. This is gonna be cool. They have wildly exceeded that statement. That may be the biggest understatement I've made in my life. That they're gonna do cool things. They've done amazing things, and you should definitely check them out, especially if you're local to Oklahoma. Check out Techlahoma, see how you can help. And see how you can become a part of it, because they really are revitalizing Oklahoma's tech scene, and it's really, really heartening and really exciting to see the work that they're doing and the results they're in. As a Texan, when I flew in here from Austin, I thought, there might be a few people at this conference, and there might be some tech in Tulsa. Y'all have surprised me. This is great. And I think it's because of organizations like Techlahoma that are trying to prove that you don't have to be in the Bay Area to be a good coder. You know? I mean, I think we can all agree with that, right? Like, you don't have to be there to be a good coder. You can be a good coder anywhere. And then I'd like to thank all of you lovely folks. This is the first time I've given a full talk on serverless. So luckily it went fairly smoothly in terms of live coding demonstrations. But thank you for listening. And as Carl Sagan points out, y'all are awesome. If you'd like to get in touch with me, my email is thenodebotanist or cass@iopipe.com. I am Node Botanist pretty much everywhere, including Overwatch. If you ever enter a match and there's someone named Node Botanist on your team or the other team, that's probably me. And come find me at lunch or at the social. I'm at that table back there, that first white table. I'm hacking on hardware today because I have some open source work I've been working on. And I'm happy to talk hardware always, but I'm also very happy to talk serverless with y'all. And we have a lot of time for questions. So questions? Wait for the microphone. They're going to bring you a microphone.
So one of the benefits you kind of mentioned at the beginning of the talk, but really didn't talk much detail, is I see there's a cost benefit of going to serverless. Have you seen anybody that's done some comparisons of running just purely on S3 versus going?
That is a wonderful question. So her question was basically, and it was mentioned on the sticker, which is actually not one of my designs, that I only pay a fraction of a cent whenever my function is run. And so her question was about, has anybody done any comparison for cost savings over a serverless architecture versus a non-serverless? Not that I'm aware of. I have not seen any white papers on the subject. However, Nordstrom just converted their entire architecture to serverless, and they've been doing some talks about it. So I would check their developer blog. They've probably mentioned something of that sort. They did a lot of talking at Serverless Conf Austin about it. So Nordstrom is a good use case. In my experience with my IoT stuff, it has been slightly cheaper, but that's a tiny, tiny sample size. So I would definitely check with companies like Nordstrom and things like that to know more about on a large scale. That was a great question. Any other questions? Okay, there we go.
So I'm thinking about the environment that gets spun up whenever you deploy this serverless function. Amazon have like a container that you can download and maybe work on it locally so you can debug before you upload it there and it makes it less painful?
Yes. So I'm still paraphrasing the questions, even though y'all can hear him on the microphone. So his question was, does AWS have a container that you can download that replicates the container that's spun up for a serverless function? Yes, they do. They keep it up to date and everything. So you can download that container and make sure, especially if you want to run like an executable or you want to run something that's not Node or just something like straight out of the box, they do have that container available for download so that you can test your functions locally. Also, the serverless framework, I should have shown this as well. You can tell the serverless framework to invoke your function locally. So if you don't want to wait for an HTTP request to go through, you don't want to wait for it to go through AWS, you can use serverless framework to invoke locally as well. So great question. Mental note, things to add to slides. Yes.
I have a question. Are people running Twitter bots through this?
I mean,
and how much would it cost for me just to like create 5 Twitter bots and then run them forever?
Okay. So to answer your first question, are people running Twitter bots? Oh yeah. Yeah. That's like one of the main reasons people use AWS for personal reasons, or Lambda for personal reasons, is to run Twitter bots. I switched all my Twitter bots over to Lambda because I was sick and tired of running my own S3 instances. And how easy would it be to run 5 Twitter bots indefinitely, and how cheap? Did you mention cost?
Yes, cost.
Considering you get, I think, 1 million requests on the free tier per month, unless your Twitter bots are running like every second or so, you can probably fit that in the free tier. Probably. AWS has a very robust free tier, and I don't know this verbatim, but I have heard that Microsoft has a very robust free tier for their serverless as well. And webtask.io has a trial, I know that much. So if you want to play with serverless, there are a lot of free options or trial options to play with. Any other questions? Can be about serverless, IoT, whatever. We got plenty of time, and I don't want to rush the people who are preparing lunch. Okay, up here. Back there, and then we'll come up here.
Hey, so there's a lot of concerns with keeping the instances warm, especially with Lambda and other server type vendors. So how do people go about? Otherwise, latency is super slow.
Right. Okay. So his question was, how do you keep instances warm? And that I feel warrants a description of what they're talking about from that context. So the latency of a serverless function can be increased by what is called a cold start. A cold start is when the serverless provider has to spin up a new container and runtime and then run your function. And so a cold start can wreak havoc on your latency because it's got all that extra time that it needs to spin everything up. There is no good way to keep instances warm yet. That's one of the things serverless is working on. AWS's cold start percentage has decreased a lot in the last few months, so they're finding a way to do it. I'm hoping they'll write how they did it. But from the user perspective, really the only way to keep your instance warm is to poll it, which is not the best solution, but that's the only solution that I've really found. That or keeping a WebSocket open to it. But some providers will time out your WebSocket after a certain amount of time. So avoiding cold starts is one of the things that serverless is actively working on right now. Wonderful question.
I was kind of curious about security from the standpoint of like firewall and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Is that all handled by AWS or?
For AWS Lambda, yes. They use the IAM provider setup, so you can basically say, I only want these people or these roles to invoke this Lambda or these groups to invoke this Lambda. So yes, you get all the security benefits you get with AWS with Lambda. I'm not sure about webtask.io's security benefits. I'm not sure about Azure Functions. I haven't really gotten to dig into those. But I can say for certain with AWS, you get all of the benefits of the IAM platform behind your application. And we have a question up front here as well. You still have a question, or? Well, the microphone will. That way, the Twitch people can hear you. There you go.
So the AWS IoT free tier, is that similarly generous in terms of what all you can do with it?
Yes, the AWS IoT tier has been very generous to me, and I think I'd push the boundaries on. So I remember my home internet was slow a couple weeks ago. And I did a net scan, and I had 53 bots running on my network, 53 different microcontrollers running things on my network. So I actually ended up having to get a second router, and I split my home Wi-Fi into subnets, so my roommate can still use Netflix while I'm working in the lab. IoT probs. Also, if my house ever explodes in a swarm of robots that then take over the world, sorry in advance. Any other questions? It'd be about speaking too. If you're interested in getting up here and speaking, that is like, we do have time, so I can answer questions about that as well. Right there. And I think another one over there once we're, yeah. Cool. Oh, perfect.
This question actually not really related to your talk. Is your job title is developer relations engineer.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about like what the difference between an engineer and like what's your job-wise developer relations?
That's a wonderful question. So the question was about my title as a developer relations engineer and how that relates to engineering and what it is. So many of you may have heard the term developer evangelist, and that relates to software as a service companies hiring developers who are part marketing, because if you market to developers, it will not work. If you send a marketing person to a conference to talk about your product in front of a bunch of developers, it will not work. You need a developer. So a developer relations engineer is a fancy secular way of saying developer evangelist. My job is to write docs, improve the product where necessary, create demos, give talks. So it's a lot of developer evangelism work. I still code very regularly for my job. But I also do a lot of public outreach, especially when it comes to users. So when a developer uses our product and has a problem, I'm the person they're going to come talk to, because I can speak their language as a developer, but I can also speak to the product team. I can speak to, everybody at the company and kind of bring a solution forward that's developer friendly. Wonderful question. And then we had one over here as well.
I was just wondering if any of these serverless options offer GPU support right now. Because right now you have to rent the really expensive large S3 nodes for a GPU.
Right. That is a wonderful question. I am not sure if AWS LAMBDA offers GPU support, and they're the only provider I can think of that would. I would check AWS, but it would be expensive as well, I'm sure. Because, that would be a... so AWS prices their Lambdas like they price S3, so that you basically, it's a certain amount of money per invocation for a certain amount of CPU and a certain amount of RAM. So I'm assuming if they do allow GPU access to Lambdas, it would be in that upper tier, much like the S3 instances. Great question. You can also link together Lambdas with an EC2 instance, so you could have it call the Lambda when it's done if you still wanted to use serverless but needed that GPU access. Any other questions about anything? Okay, if you have a question that you just don't want to ask in front of everybody, I'll be over there at the table with all the hardware, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. And you can also talk to me on Twitter, and I'll put my email address up there one more time. Come on, there we go. So the Node Botanist or cass@iopipe.com. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful lunch and the rest of your day.